Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's Twice Removed. I'm Natalie, in case you haven't met me before. I run a business called Genealogy Stories, and I'm really passionate about writing your family history. And I think in order to write it, you need to know some historical context. So I spend every other Tuesday interviewing all sorts of different historians, always with a family history slant. And today I'm joined by a previous guest who gave me a masterclass in Chartism, which is one of my all-time favourite interviews from Twice Removed, so I'm really delighted to have you back. Hi, Mark. Would you mind introducing you to anyone who hasn't met you before?
Sure. Hi. No pressure then, Natalie. Well, thanks for having me back on. I'm the author of a family history book called Tracing Your Labour Movement Ancestors, which came out 10 years ago now. 12 years ago now. Although the history obviously hasn't changed in it, things like the links and so forth probably don't work anymore, but the history is the same. I've written for a number of family history magazines about trade union history, some of which are now defunct, the magazines, but I don't think that was entirely my fault. And many years ago, I actually worked for a trade union for a few years as editor of their magazine, because I'm a journalist by trade. So that's me and my connection with trade union history.
And you also have a brilliant Chartism website.
Yes, that's
very up to date.
Yes, I wasn't mentioning Chartism. We've done Chartism, but yeah, that's the sort of that is a topic I really enjoy and do a lot of work on. Partly because I've got sort of family history in that myself. chartisancestors.co.uk is worth a look if people are interested in that.
Okay, great. So just to remind people as well, if you want to comment and ask questions, please feel free at any time to pop them in the comments box and I'll do my best to get them up on screen. So Mark, can we start right at the very beginning? What is a trade union? Definition.
Right. So it's these things you sort of think, oh yeah, I know what a trade union is, or I know what it is. Then actually you sit down, you think, well, actually, how do I define it? What is it? So I did look at what other people had said a trade union was. And actually the best definition I came up with was one that was written by Sidney and Beatrice Webb, who are historians way back at the sort of end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, and the first serious historians of trade unionism. And their definition, if I can sort of break it down into the bits as we go through it, it's only one sentence, but there's quite a lot packed into there. So it's a continuous association of wage earners. So a continuous association, it means it's sort of an ongoing thing. It's not just a one-off that sort of comes together for a particular cause, a particular issue, and then dissolves and disappears off. Of wage earners, so workers, people who are employed. These days the definition is a bit broader because we've got people working for sort of the likes of Uber and so forth, where there's much dispute about whether they are wage earners or contractors or whatever, but the broad principle is the same: continuous association of wage earners for the purpose of maintaining or improving the conditions of their employment. Okay. So partly it's maintaining or improving, so partly it's defensive. It's about being there to try to prevent things getting worse, whether that's pay cuts or health and safety issues, or improving. So hopefully, earning more or getting better working conditions, shorter hours, and so forth. And conditions of employment, well, we know what those are: pay, working hours, all those sorts of things. So a continuous association of wage earners for the purpose of maintaining or improving the conditions of their employment is the one sentence, but quite meaty definition.
Yeah, I like that. It's quite packed, like you say, it packs quite a lot in there. So how did trade unions kind of originate and when?
Well, there's always been, people have always come together collectively about work issues. You can go right back to the Tudor times when there's actually legislation dating from, I think, the time of Henry VIII, certainly Elizabeth I, attempting to stop workers combining together to demand wage increases and so forth.
Oh, really?
Whether you could define those as trade unions is another matter, of course.
No, yeah.
Not continuous associations. That falls down on the first bit of the definition. But the principle is there that people are working together to try and make their working lives better. The first trade unions, as we were begin to recognise them, are sort of right towards the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, when you start getting workplace organised associations with a sort of longer life coming together. Minor problem in that period that workers' combinations were most definitely illegal. So, in doing that, in coming together, people were risking quite a lot, imprisonment, potentially, certainly fines. And it was really quite difficult. But, trade unions weren't just about sort of strikes and what they said to workers. It was partly about what they did amongst themselves. So you're looking at things like organising sick clubs, where they would pay out if someone was sick. Insurance if their tools were lost, stolen, damaged.
Okay, so quite similar to sort of friendly societies.
Big overlap. I mean, people didn't sort of sit down at the time and say, shall we have a trade union or shall we have a friendly society? They were basically saying, well, what do we need to do to protect ourselves? And some of those things we would recognise as friendly society type activities, and some became trade union type activities. And quite a lot of the time we're talking about the same organisation, so it's only later that those begin to separate, so that the friendly society of odd fellows or whatever don't take people out on strike, and the National Union of Mine Workers doesn't really do a lot of the things that a friendly society would have done, or didn't do those things. So yeah, they do separate out in due course, but even today, trade unions still do an element of that sort of thing. It's still a part of what they do.
Okay.
Much less so since the advent of the welfare state over the course of the 20th century and so forth. But it's still in there.
Okay. So what kind of trades had a trade union start with? Was it very kind of labour intensive trades, or was it more kind of artisan type trades? Or
it mostly is in that artisan thing. So you're looking at people like carpenters, people with shoemakers, people with a skilled trade. And as I say, partly it's a defensive type organisation. So one of the things they're trying to do is keep out unskilled labour from the stuff they do. So, if you're a carpenter, for example, you don't really want anyone coming along who's got a hammer and a saw taking over your job. So it's about organising to ensure that actually only qualified carpenters, recognised carpenters, are doing that work. So there's that defensive element to it. And that's obviously much easier to do and much more necessary when you're looking at a skilled occupation, an artisan type occupation, than it is with a sort of general labourer type role, where it's much more difficult to protect the what you get for your work and how it's organised and so forth. So yeah, very definitely sort of skilled work at the start.
okay,
and in fact, for a very long time through the 19th century, that's the case.
okay, and then so when you say trade unions, to me, I tend to think of more political organisations, and I tend to think about their relationship with the Labour Party. Historically, how did that? Yeah, start from the beginning. Historically, how did that kind of emerge? That
So trade unions and politics, basically. So yeah, I mean, originally, obviously, trade unions being workplace based, they're initially talking to individual employers, individual organisations they work for, about pay and time off and working conditions and all those sorts of things. But actually, as trade unions become more sort of organised in national bodies later into the 19th century, there's a sort of a sense that actually, you can fight every employer one by one to get a pay rate for the job, or whatever the issue is. But the better way of going about it is by applying pressure in government to say, well, actually, we would like government to set a national maximum working week of 84 hours or whatever the thing might be. And so trade unions sort of start getting into politics with this realization that you can win for your members by getting the law changed or by getting government policy changed. And that applies more broadly in many cases than if you're trying to win everything employer at a time. So that's initially where it comes from. Of course, 19th century, very few workers could vote anyway. Really, it's not until we get to sort of the 1880s and Gladstone's Reform Act there, which adds 2-3 million working men to the electorate, that there becomes any point at all in trade unions trying to actually sort of get anyone elected who would represent them. And initially, they did that through the Liberal Party. So, the Liberal Party recognised the need, if it was having lots of working class voters, to have some working class MPs as well. So you have these Lib Lab MPs who are really part of the Liberal Party but have connections into the trade unions. And it's not until the early 20th century that you start to get proper Labour MPs, because the electorate has broadened to include working men and, in due course, women. And so it becomes a point to organising a Labour Party which represents Labour and the trade unions.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So at that point, is that where the kind of legalities about being in a trade union or running a trade union begin to change as well, presumably?
Oh, the legalities sort of changed a long way back, but it was a slow process. So, as I say, the Combination Acts and various other bits of legislation made it difficult, if not impossible, to organise right up until the 1820s. And for that reason, actually, there are virtually no trade union records before the 1820s.
Okay.
So if you're a family historian looking for stuff before that date, there's nothing to find, because if there were any records, which is unlikely, they would have been hidden away, up a chimney somewhere, because you don't want to provide the authorities with a list of all the people they can then go and arrest.
Sure. How did do we know much about how they communicated their actions, especially to people who weren't necessarily highly literate, although they might have been in skilled trades? They still might have not had what we'd consider kind of full literacy skills.
Yeah, but of course at that stage, a lot of it was people working together in workplaces.
Okay.
It's not really until later that you begin to get national organisation. So word of mouth, branch meetings, that sort of thing. But increasingly, from the 1830s through, you've got these campaigns against the taxes on knowledge, the stamp duty on newspapers and so forth, to make newspapers cheaper. Literacy starts to improve as that is achieved. But also, even before then, you've got this sort of collective readership of newspapers. So, your local pub might subscribe to the Chartist Northern Star newspaper, and someone every Saturday would read it out, and people would listen to it. Yeah. So, even if you couldn't read yourself, you were still getting what was in the newspaper. And of course, they're written in quite a different way, a lot of them.
I think that's...
Sorry.
No, I was just going to say, I think that's one of the things I really like about that kind of period in time, actually, is that people do start to become more political, even if it's on a very small local scale, even if it's a few men talking in the pub. They're doing that in a way that they weren't necessarily doing in the kind of Georgian period. And I think that's really interesting.
Yeah.
I think you can sometimes kind of imagine that your ancestors were just sat putting up with their lot, and I don't. But talking to people like you, I start to realize that's actually not really as simple as that. It's not necessarily the case.
It's not. Even if you go back to the 1820s, early 1820s, where you've got the Luddites. You occasionally do that in sort of GCSE history or whatever, and it's a few blokes who came along and burnt machines. Actually, it wasn't like that. There was a lot more thought to it. There was organisation. There was pressure on employers not to introduce this machinery that was going to put them all out of work. And it was only as a last resort that some people organised to attack the machinery, attack the factories. And you can understand it. What else can they do? They're going to lose their livelihoods, their families' livelihoods, their whole community's livelihoods, because in that instance, for example, spinning or weaving, it's moving over from handloom stuff to automated machinery, and you just don't need the people for it. So that's communicated quite widely, and it's well understood. So they were political, and it wasn't just a bunch of people saying, "Oh, don't like these machines," and setting fire to them. It was it was an organised political activity for a purpose.
Sure. Okay. So I was going to ask you about how you were saying just before we came into the interview, you were updating me. You had some numbers about how many days were lost in strikes now, and compared to World War II, which no, was it World War One? Which I
World War
thought was
One we were
quite
looking at.
fascinating. So I didn't
Yeah.
realise that people were still striking to the extent that they were during the war. And I just wondered whether you'd mind sharing those figures.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the Edwardian period had been quite a turbulent period anyway, industrially, and there was a lot more strikes, a lot more unions organising. So in terms of sort of number of days lost to strikes is the sort of standard way of calculating it. So what you do is you take the course of a year or whatever the time period is, and you say how many people multiplied by how many days those people were on strike. So, it might be 1,000 people for 10 days, and that's 10,000 days, or it might be 100 people for 100 days, and it's the same outcome, 10,000. So most recent figures I could find were 2018. I'm sure there must be more recent, but the number of days lost to strikes in 2018 in this country was 26,000, which might seem quite a lot, but actually, if you work it out in terms of what I was just saying about how you calculate it, if there'd been a one-day civil service strike, that would have been 100,000. So 26,000 is not that many. But if you go back, so 1915, even though there was some sort of industrial truce, the TUC had organised a truce with the government, but it wasn't going to have official strikes. There was still 3 million strike days lost to industrial action in 1915. 1916, it halved, it dropped to about 2.5 million.
Still a lot, considering there's a war going on, isn't there?
Absolutely. 1917, there were 5.5 million days lost to strikes. So, there was a lot happening. And actually, as you go through a decade beyond that into the 1920s, and you get to the general strike in 1926, which was principally organised around the miners, but other people came out in support of them. There were, let me just read the number, there were 162 million days lost to strikes, as I say, compared to 26,000 recently.
That's huge, isn't it? That does put it
so enormous. Even when you take into account that there were 1 million miners in those days, it's still an enormous number of strike days.
So that is huge. It really puts into perspective, actually, about how much power, how powerful going on strike could be if you had, those kind of numbers. So you mentioned the general strike there. What was the general strike?
Okay, so we're looking at 1926. Things were pretty tough after the end of the war. As you can imagine, the economy was not in a great state. By 1926, the mine owners, coal mining was still in private hands in those days, were attempting to cut wages. So this was going back to that definition. This was about the maintaining conditions of employment. So it was attempting to resist those cuts in wages. And there was something called the Triple Alliance between the Miners' Federation of Great Britain, so with 1 million members, the National Union of Railwaymen, which had a similar number of members, and the other transport unions. So, this was a big alliance of people. And the idea was that the miners would go on strike to resist this. They would get support from those other unions, and that this effectively would bring the country to a halt until government applied pressure to the mine owners not to cut people's wages. Everyone was out for 9 days, 9 days of millions of people being on strike. And you do occasionally see, it comes up in sort of period dramas, and it comes up in newsreel and so forth, and you see sort of, old Etonians driving buses, and someone's butler doing some other job that they would never normally have done things. But actually, this was a serious situation for the country as a whole. And I think, there was this sense that there'd been the Russian Revolution less than a decade earlier. So, there was this sense that there could be something very serious politically come out of this. However, the railway workers and the transport workers said that they couldn't sell this to their members in the end, that their members were not prepared to come out and support the miners. And so after 9 days, the general strike was called off, called to a halt. There were supposedly further negotiations, but the miners stayed out on strike for months after months after month, and eventually they lost. Despite everything, their pay was cut, which terrible position, because it wasn't exactly well paid in the first place, and having that money cut back. So that was not a great experience, and trade union membership slumped after that. It really did, and it didn't really pick up again until the Second World War, or certainly until the economy picked up in the run up to the Second World War.
When they decided to take strike action in 1926, were they basing that on how successful previous strikes had been, or what kind of led to that decision to take that particular action, I guess?
I mean, there had never been anything on that scale before.
Okay.
Certainly. And in fact, in some ways, it was odd to have a miners' strike that sparked this, because the miners, lots of trade unions had long before this had centralised to a great extent, and you could share resources across the whole country and make decisions nationally. The miners' unions were always much more localised, and all the power rested in, if not the areas, Scotland or the Midlands or whatever, then, or even in the lodges, in the individual mine itself. So it was unusual that it's unexpected, really, that you would get this sort of dispute from such a devolved organisation. But yeah, I mean, over by that stage, over 100 years, there had been all sorts of disputes about pay and all sorts of other things, and some of them had ended successfully for the unions, some of them had ended unsuccessfully. But in this case, they weren't on the offensive looking for more money, they were on the defensive trying to stop money being taken away from them. So, they possibly thought they had no option anyway.
Yeah, I suppose if you're going to lose your pay anyway, then it's kind of your back's against the wall, isn't it?
Yeah.
So, could you tell me about some of those other key strikes in the past? So I think, am I thinking, for some reason I want to say London Docks.
Yeah, absolutely. Dock strike was a really important one. So 1889, it started as a fairly small dispute where one employer on the docks, because again, it was quite segmented, so you had lots of employers in the London docks. It wasn't just sort of one organisation that was employing everyone. So one organisation, one employer, was refusing to pay the traditional bonus for fast work in unloading a particular ship or whatever. But that sort of spread. So eventually you get 100,000 dockers in London alone out on strike. And what they're after is what's called the dockers' tanner. They wanted sixpence a day for their work. And that strike lasted, I've made a note somewhere. No, I haven't. That strike lasted many weeks anyway. That stretched through, and it was eventually brought to an end by mediation by Cardinal Manning, who was the head of the Catholic Church in England at that point. A significant figure in the East End of London, because there were so many dockers of Irish ancestry, Irish Catholic ancestry, in London, in the London's East End at that time. And that was a huge strike, and the importance wasn't necessarily so much in what it immediately achieved. It was in what it did for trade unionism, because out of that you get a whole series of trade unions are formed where it'd been fairly ununionized before and unorganized, and you get new trade unions emerging from that dispute, which spread across the country, and for the first time really start organising unskilled workers. And that does fall back a bit in the years afterwards. But actually, when you get into the 20th century, those organisations are there, and they become the basis for things like the Transport and General Workers Union, which became the biggest union in the country, General Municipal Workers Union, which was the second biggest in the country. So, they're laying the foundations there for 20th century trade unionism. So, really important dispute because of that.
And what year was the doc? What sort of year was it?
It was 1889.
1889.
Yeah.
I'm going to have to go check now, because I think I've got some London dock workers in that period. So I have to go check my family tree now. So when you say they were out on strike, does that mean they were just sitting at home or and not working, or were they on the streets kind of protesting, or what did that look like?
No, they were on the streets. There are photographs, a bit grainy, bit difficult to make out what's going on, but of huge demonstrations and marches and so forth, but also of attempts to raise funds. And lots of people from all over the country contributed money to support the dockers and their families, who clearly, obviously, while they were on strike, they weren't getting paid, and they had to have some money to eat, to buy food to eat. So there was a massive fundraising effort. So, it's not just a case of going on strike, sitting at home, doing nothing and waiting. Actually, you've got to go out and hustle and make sure you've got the support, whether that's sort of morally or better still financially.
Yeah.
So you can keep the dispute going and keep it at the forefront of people's minds, and try and win in that way.
And presumably some of the people that were leading the trade unions, so some of the people that had started them or headed them up, were people of slightly better means, I'm just guessing, or slightly more middle class backgrounds, or?
Well, on the whole, certainly from that dispute, you've got people like Ben Tillett and Tom Mann. No, they come from the shop floor, essentially.
Okay, so they know exactly what it's like to not have that money, and how difficult that is for the people that they're asking to strike. That's really interesting.
Absolutely. I mean, they're probably a bit more politicized than most of the workers, so they're involved in some of the sort of early socialist organizations like the Social Democratic Federation or the Independent Labour Party. So they've got a sense of, a wider perspective, and it's something they've thought more about over a period of time. But no, they are of the workers. They are of one with those people that were on strike.
Oh, that's wonderful. I would love to have one of those in my family tree.
Keep looking.
Go really, really wide. Yeah.
My 12th cousin, 17 times removed.
Yeah, does it still count in law? Does it count? Yeah. So we've talked a lot about men striking, but what about women and women's trade unionism? When did that kind of start?
Yeah, so you do get quite a lot of it in sort of Lancashire, Yorkshire, around the textile industries.
Yeah.
But the really interesting bit actually is sort of from the 1890s onwards, and you start to get disputes involving small groups. So I mean, you've probably heard of the Match Women's Strike, which actually, again, East End of London, and a year before the Dockers' strike, so 1888. Okay. So you're starting to get these small groups who are in sort of sweated workshops on appalling pay, long hours, quite cut off from other groups, but these individual disputes begin to bubble up, and you then get the National Federation of Women Workers being formed, attempting to bring those together. If I talk about the National Federation a little bit, so it takes us to someone called Mary MacArthur, who was born in 1880 in Scotland, in Ayr, and her dad was a grocer, a shopkeeper, Tory shopkeeper, which may sound a bit Margaret Thatcherish at the minute, but he sent her along to spy on the Shop Assistants Union. She ended up as branch secretary instead.
Go Mary.
Yeah, go Mary. And from there, she became active in the Independent Labour Party. She was elected to her union's national executive and sort of began to make links elsewhere. She met her husband, who subsequently became an ILP MP, or a Labour Party MP, but who died in the flu epidemic in 1918. And she moved to London with him. So was involved in the Women's Trade Union League. As I say, it's established the Woman Worker as a sort of monthly magazine, and the National Federation of Women Workers in 1906. And that, as I say, started pulling all these disparate smaller organisations and unorganisations, if you like, together into one national body. And it was important in things like the Chadley Heath chainmakers strike in when was that one? Sorry, let me check that one. Chadley Heath, 1910, in the West Midlands. So the work was quite separated. So you tended to have the men working in chain making, they're making the big chains, the sort of thing for tying ships to the docks and so forth in factories, furnaces. The women were working mostly with smaller chains. So thinking in terms of, I don't know, the stuff you might use to keep your gate shut or so forth, that sort of size of chain. But that was homework, and it was very, very poorly paid. So 1910, there was a recommendation from a trade board for a pay rise, which should have applied to everyone, the fruits of this political organisation that we were talking about earlier. But lots of the employers ignored it, so they weren't going to implement it. So again, there you get 1,000 women out on strike, organised by the National Women Workers, and they won that dispute sort of one employer at a time. They gradually rolled them all up until they all started paying the recommended rate after 10 weeks, which was a massive 2.5 pence an hour.
These people must have had such resilience, though, to go out week after week after week after week after week and not and to be fighting one employer at a time, and for it to be that slow. That takes an awful lot of grit, I think.
It does, and if you're on strike for 10 weeks with no income, that's tough. But as I say,
I was going to say, presumably, if you're a woman working, then it's because your family needed you to have a woman working.
Oh, absolutely.
During that period,
Yeah, I mean, I think, probably all of us as family historians were used to this idea that, women didn't work. But actually, you look back and, of course, they all worked. Middle-class, well-off women didn't work. Everybody else did.
Yeah.
It depends which women you're looking at. So Mary MacArthur, as I say, very important in National Federation of Women Workers, and actually she sort of steered it. She opposed the First World War, but actually she was, once it started, I think she was involved in for the government organising women's labour in that. End of the war, she was back organising and steered the National Federation of Women Workers into amalgamation with a couple of other unions and formed the National Union of General Workers, which is still in existence today as the GMB. Is still a big, important union, and sadly ended up dying on the day that the union came into existence at the age of just 41.
Oh, that's young.
Yeah. Terrible, really. But she'd achieved so much in such a short period of time, particularly for women workers.
I think what's really interesting about her story as well is that being the daughter of a shopkeeper, she didn't necessarily have to join the union or have that kind of personal incentive to do it. So something must have spoken to her. She must have seen something that she thought was presumably a moral obligation somehow to do
so.
This.
A matter of conviction and of belief. That's what she thought was right.
It's interesting. Wish she was in my tree.
I wouldn't say no. Actually, just mentioning it, there's a great recent book about her. It only came out recently by an author called Kathy Hunt, and it's called Righting the Wrong. So it's worth having if you're interested in Mary MacArthur. Righting the Wrong by Kathy Hunt is well worth a look.
Oh, thank you for that. I would definitely put that on my very, very long reading list and make sure there's a link to it in the blog post that goes out with this video.
Yeah.
So what kind of was actually, before I ask this next question, I'll just remind anyone who's watching, feel free to comment with your questions as well. But I know when we were prepping for the interview, I made a note to ask you about some of your favourite disputes and union stories, and I've just got one little line that says, "Ask Mark about music halls."
Yes. So the music hall strike of 1907. So again, we're in that Edwardian era where everything kicks off, and lots of women workers in that industry as well. So you get to 1907 and music halls, which are themselves getting more organised. They're now sort of becoming part of chains. They're not necessarily all separate organisations, and they start putting on extra matinee performances, and they're expecting performers to do those for no extra money. And also at the same time, they're attempting to bar their performers from working for other chains, other music halls. So, which had been, you hear stories. Actually, I'm not an expert on music halls and variety, but you do hear these stories of people doing a show here and then running up the road and doing the same show at another music hall. But they're trying to stop that. They're trying to get more performances out of their performers and not pay them any more money for it. So, inevitably that leads to a bit of a dispute. And it's the Variety Artists Federation, it's called, that leads that strike. And it began at the Holborn Empire, but eventually spread to 22 variety theatres across London. There's quite a lot of these places. And it's sort of interesting that it wasn't just the sort of the people in the chorus line. It did attract support from big names. So, one of the most prominent spokespeople for it was Mary Lloyd, who, was known for her sort of risque performances, songs like "I Sits Among the Cabbages and Peas."
Great.
All entirely innocent, I'm sure. But,
sounds like something my 5-year-old would sing.
But she was a huge name. At least partly because she did songs like that and was constantly being sort of pulled up before the magistrates and attempting then to convince them that actually there's nothing rude about that. Peas, they're a perfectly normal vegetable. So it gets those sort of that big name support, and she sort of says, we the stars can dictate our own terms. We're not fighting for ourselves, but for the poorer members of the profession, earning 30 shillings to £3 a week. So that's really important sort of support you're getting. If she won't perform, then the music halls are stuffed, basically.
Yeah.
And they did won that. They won an agreed minimum wage and maximum working hours, both for performers and people off stage. So that was quite a nice little strike. You also get others from the same period and just after the First World War. So there was a barbers' strike again in London, where all the barbers went on strike for more money. And they would do things like when strike breakers were brought in to try and provide services, they would go round up the hairiest men they could find and make sure they all queued up for a haircut to keep these people busy for doing a tuppenny haircut for the next hour and a half or whatever. And again, they won that dispute, but the papers loved that one because certainly their cartoonists did, and there are newspaper cartoons if you look back to that period of illustrating the strike and people's hair growing, beards growing longer and longer.
They just come out of the lockdown.
Absolutely, yeah. Yes, we're all used to it now. It's how we all looked last year, but.
I was going to ask you about the press actually in a second, but I've just had somebody pop in with a question. If it's okay to pop that up on screen. So, Brian is just asking: is it right that the Farm Labourers Union was started by the Methodist Church?
I think it's fair to say lots of farm labourers were nonconformists of one kind or another, including Methodists. So particularly if you look at the Tolpuddle martyrs, who in the 1830s were all transported off to Australia. We remember that as being for organising a trade union. Actually, it was for administering an illegal oath, but that was part of the sort of the joining thing for a trade union. So it was, in reality, it was about trade unionism, and they were all nonconformists. I think they were Methodists. So there was that strong connection there. The Methodist Church itself didn't. The Methodist Church was quite anti-political activity. It looked to God for salvation, not to not to
That's actually
strikes.
doing something.
Yeah, but all through the 19th century, well into the 20th century, there's been a very strong Methodist and nonconformist tradition through into trade union and labour politics. I mean, the strongest, actually the strongest traditions, and it depends which unions you look at, have been in sort of Methodism or in Catholicism. So, if the Church of England just misses out in the middle, that's this idea that the Tory party is the Church of England. No, the Church of England is the Tory party at prayer, but the nonconformists, the Catholics, were the trade unionists essentially. So, yeah, there's an element of truth in it. But certainly later on, it's someone called Joseph Arch who organises the agricultural workers' first union, or first enduring union in the 1870s. I don't really know his biography. I wouldn't be in the slightest bit surprised if he came from a Methodist and nonconformist background as well.
It's interesting as well, because I quite often associate non-conformist areas with mining as well. So, Wales, I've got a lot of Welsh ancestry, and a lot of my Welsh ancestors, like a lot of Welsh, were non-conformists, and a lot of them were miners, so you kind of almost associate it with hand in hand, which is quite interesting.
Yes.
So you were saying there about the caricature in the press, just moving a step backwards, but great question. Thank you, Brian. What was the kind of press reaction to strikes, and presumably it varied depending on the strike and over time?
Yeah, I mean, generally, the sort of people who own newspapers are the same sorts of people who own factories or own coal mines or whatever. So at heart, they're not necessarily terribly sympathetic. But certainly in the early days, where you're looking at a fairly strong local radical press, you would get more support there. And it's really only once the press itself starts to build up and become more big business that you get a lot of hostility to trade unionism and so forth. Certainly, by the time you get to the general strike, there is sort of united opposition to trade unions and strikes and things. But one of the things actually that the general strike did was it stopped all newspapers from publishing. There were, throughout the general strike period of that 9 days, there were only two newspapers published. One was published by the government, and it was edited by Winston Churchill, and the other one was published by the TUC.
Okay, yeah. So, that's funny enough. You just reminded me, actually, a long time ago, and I've completely forgotten about this until you were talking. I had a client who had Sheffield ancestors, and one of them was a publican who was also in a trade union member or sympathetic to the trade unions. And there was an incident where some strike breakers were pulled into the pub and quite badly beaten up, and it went to court and press, and obviously the newspaper took a very dim view of the people that had been violent. But then when you looked across newspapers, there were different variations of the story, and it was interesting. But it just reminded me that it's always worth looking at who printed or who published the newspaper, which you can always find either on the first or the last page of the paper, and then going and seeing if you can find out who that person is, either just by Googling them or checking on the census or whatever, because you'll like you say, you'll get their political, you might get hints at why they're writing it with a certain angle potentially. So
editors and proprietors have their own political views, and they will differ, they will vary. On the whole, they tend to be pro-establishment rather than pro-worker, because they're business owners.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, and I think sometimes you forget that, actually. Okay, so we've talked about the kind of earlier history of strikes, but obviously I think one of the most famous strikes is the kind of miners' strikes in the 1970s. And how do they kind of compare to their earlier counterpart strikes? Generally, when you talk about strikes, again, I tend to think of strikes failing, and I don't know, that's being a child of the 80s. So kind of linked to that is my question is how successful have trade unions been if you kind of take a wider picture of them?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'll come on to the 70s miners' strikes in a second, because they are
Sure.
quite different to 1926 and to 1984, 85. But just generally, when we were talking earlier, we talked about, well, have trade unions been successful? Can you point to something where they've succeeded? And in some ways, it's quite difficult, because a lot of it takes place with individual employers. So there's, over the years, there have been thousands of small or large strikes, some of which have succeeded in part, some of which in whole, some of which have failed dismally. So it's difficult to sort of point to individual ones and know all of them. And equally, if a union goes in because there's a danger of redundancies, and the union manages to negotiate down the number of redundancies or to get the employers to do something other than that, then you can claim that as a success, but it's very difficult to sort of surface that and say that's a win for trade unions. One thing you can point at, though, is there's something called the union wage dividend. So it's been calculated for years and years and years, and you can say, well, looking at workers in union organised jobs and companies and comparing their wages to workers in non-unionized jobs and companies, how do the wages compare? And there's consistently, and not just in this country, been a dividend for union organized workers. They've always earned more.
Okay, that's interesting.
So, I mean, at one point it was something like 25% more. And I think, as unions have weakened over the decades, that percentage has come down, but it's still there. It still exists. So there is a really tangible thing you can point at and say, yes, that's happened. But also with the move towards sort of politics and attempting to influence things through politics, you can look at things like the national minimum wage, or these are just recent ones: national minimum wage, the right to paid maternity leave. I think the right to be accompanied at a hearing with your employer. Which is as recent as 1999 as a legal right. It was implemented by the Blair government.
Okay.
And a lot of these things are pushed for by trade unions, and they're things that they might have won in one or two places, one or two workplaces, but then they want to generalize them.
Okay, so it kind of has like a snowball effect.
Yeah, these people in this organization or this industry are benefiting from paid maternity leave. Actually, so should everyone. Let's make it the law. So all those things, people can point to and say, well, that's unions. Unions sort of didn't legislate for paid maternity leave or whatever, but without them, it's difficult to believe they would have happened. So yeah, there are all of those things. And there was something else I was going to say, and I've gone completely blank.
I'll come back to you later. Don't worry.
So yeah, there are things you can point to and say, oh, we were going to talk about the minor strikes of the 70s, weren't they?
Yeah, and how they compare to earlier. Yeah,
and that is relevant in terms of being able to point to successes for trade unions, because unlike 1926, unlike 1984, they weren't defensive strikes; they were on the offensive. So by the early 1970s, miners had dropped from always being in sort of the top 4 or 5 industrial occupations in terms of pay. They dropped way down the scale, to where were they? They were below average for industrial workers by that point, so below halfway. But there'd been no national strikes, no official strikes since 1926. So things had gradually built up slowly, bit by bit, but then they'd fallen over by 1970. But also the number of miners had fallen. So, there'd been 1 million miners by the 1950s. There were 700,000. By 1970, there were only 290,000. So the number had fallen. But as I say, the issue was about pay. The issue was about wanting more money to restore their position in the earnings league table. And so there was a strike in 1972 in January and February, always a good time for miners' strike, because what do you heat the country with? What do you run the country on? Or certainly in the 1970s, but coal. So, there's no point striking in July and August because it doesn't have any impact whatsoever. So there was, excuse me, 2 month strike, and in the end they got a pay offer which they accepted that took them right back up to the top of the wages league table for industrial workers. 1970s, lots going on in the economy. It was all over the place, massive inflation, massive the energy crisis and so forth. So there was a lot of turbulence, and as early as 1973, miners' wages have fallen back again relatively. They were way down the league table again. They were offered 7%, which, if you remember, well, no, you won't remember, but you may remember, inflation was way up into double figures in the 1970s, way up. So they rejected that pay offer. They went on strike, and that's the strike in late 1973, early 74. That people remember, power cuts and the 3-day week to save fuel because you couldn't run your factories if you didn't have the fuel. And this was because it was such an important thing, because it was a national thing, because it was a nationalised industry. This was a dispute between the government, Ted Heath's government, and the National Union of Mine Workers, effectively. Ted Heath went to the country, February 1974 general election, on the question, who governs? And the answer came back from the electorate, not you. So the incoming Labour government under Harold Wilson increased their pay by 35%, as soon as they came into office, and by another 35% a year later. So, if you're looking at successful industrial disputes, then getting 70% or so over a period of 2 years is probably quite a successful outcome for a strike, especially if it only lasts a few weeks.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that was a great success for the mine workers. 1984, we were talking about, memories of it having it being a defeat for the mine workers. It certainly was, but again, we're back onto a defensive thing by then. This time, that wasn't about pay; it was about pit closures. And Arthur Scargill, who was the president of the National Union of Mine Workers, said that there was a government plan to reduce the number of pits to a small number. I can't remember the numbers of pits there were and how many he said there were going to be afterwards, and that this would devastate mining communities. And so there was the miners' strike, which started in March 1984, went on for an entire year for many miners. Again, they had some support in other trade unions, but not many other trade unions came out in support of them industrially. So that strike dragged on. Essentially, by the end, the miners had to go back to work. They lost that dispute. And of course, it was said at the time, absolute nonsense. Of course, there's no plan to close the mines down. What would the country do? And we now have no coal mines, no deep coal mines in this country, and haven't had for years. So, there was a plan to close down the coal mines. The plan there was to use coal brought in from cheaper foreign producers, and to break the power of the National Union of Mine Workers, particularly, that they wanted revenge after 1973, 74, not to put too fine a point on it.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I'm a child of the early 80s, so I don't remember any of this, and I don't tend to look at more recent history. I tend to forget about it and go further back. But I do remember growing up. I do remember people talking about it, when I was growing up, and I remember things like when the Billy Elliot film came out, and my mum would say, "Oh yeah, I remember that," and I'm not from a mining background, and I have a southern family as well, but it's certainly an event that's, I think, is really etched on a lot of people's collective consciousness. It's it's a big event.
Absolutely huge, and you sort of forget how many people were involved and how widespread mining was. There were so for a southern background, so there were coal mines in Kent. There was a
Yeah.
Kent coalfield,
Okay.
which you forget about. There was before that, I think it was dry by then, but there was a Somerset coalfield, Somerset miners. But huge numbers in sort of South Wales, in the northeast of England, in Yorkshire, in Nottinghamshire, Leicestershire, the northwest. So it was, and whole communities were built around the pit. It wasn't just that 5% of people who worked in this town were in the coal mine. Everybody was.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah,
so
because it's so locational, isn't it?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
It's
So
different from other trades.
Yeah, I mean that was one of the big things. It just decimated entire communities
Mm.
with no plan on how to deal with that. It was just, it's closed, go and find another job.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so going a little bit further back, if you find, or how would you even know whether your ancestor may have been in a trade union?
Right. Well, it's worth remembering that for all the millions of people that have been in trade unions, it's always still been a minority pursuit. So by 1979, which was the peak year of trade unionism, actually half the workforce, 10 million people were in trade unions, but still only half the workforce.
Okay.
And that was the absolute peak. So you go back a few years, a few decades, a century or so, and although there's large numbers, 250,000 people in this union, 500,000 in that, seems like a lot, but it's still a minority. So it's not guaranteed that there will have been. It's difficult if you believe that they may have been. It's a case of tracking down the right union, a union that might be credibly one they remember of, and then finding out if that union existed at the right time, and if so, where those records are. So, I mean, one thing that really helps is, as I say, starting with the right union. I've got a website actually called unionancestors.co.uk, which I don't really do much with. It's just created and it sits there. But what it does do is it lists 5,000 trade unions that have existed at one point or another.
Wow.
It's
That's a
just
huge
vast
number.
numbers.
Okay.
Huge numbers.
Yeah.
Many of them were very local or only existed for a short time. But have a look at that. But it's worth thinking laterally. If your ancestor was in shoemaking, you can't just look up shoemaking. You've got to look up boot making and clog making, and
Okay. And presumably location plays a part as well.
Yeah, location and time. So I think the thing is you want to draw up a sort of basket or a list of unions that look vaguely possible.
Yeah.
And then track down a book called The Historical Directory of Trade Unions. Whoops, no, can't get in the screen.
There we go. Yeah.
There are 6 volumes of that, and they each have it's sort of little biographies of trade unions.
Okay.
So if you've got sort of 6 unions that you think are possible, actually, if you can find a copy of that in a library somewhere, you need to look at each of those 6 and establish, is it in the right geographical area, and did it exist at the right period? Because it's great finding a union. You think, absolutely, that's perfect. And then you discover that it became defunct 50 years before your ancestor was born. It's not very helpful. So, you can narrow it down from that. When you've narrowed it down, it's then, well, what records are there that might be still in existence, where there might be stuff about my ancestor? And you need to think out what records there are. So there are, trade union journals is a great one. If ever you were active in a trade union, then the chances are you probably got a name check somewhere in your years of membership doing something. Even if you weren't particularly active, even when you retired or something, you probably got a name check somewhere. So you possibly appeared in that. For some unions, there are things called admission books, which were when you joined, they entered your name into a huge leather-bound ledger and kept that, and that would have recorded a bit of information about you. There were some membership lists. Not many unions had a central membership list. Some of them did, and it's worth checking those. And those also record things like whether you claimed against the various things that you could claim for. You could claim for things like if your wife died. Some unions had a payment, insurance, life insurance thing for family members. There are all sorts of other sort of returns from branches to national unions. There's branch records really haven't really survived, but there are national reports and things. So it's worth thinking about what those records are, and also where you might find them. So there are some limited amounts of records. I say limited, there's vast numbers, but in overall terms, it's a small proportion on the Find My Past website.
Okay.
So there are some digitized records there from trade unions. So people like, I think, the Associated Carpenters and Joiners from the 18...
I think that is on there as well. And I've got a feeling I want to say something to do with lighting as well. Just going off the top of my head. Yeah, there is a few.
Yeah, but those records are basically, they've come from the Modern Records Centre at the University of Warwick. And that probably is the most important repository for trade union records in the country. And they have got vast amounts. And they are busy digitizing them like mad, and have been all through lockdown. But there is so much. There is so much to digitize that it's a small proportion of what they've got. And I know they're still working on that. I was up there a few weeks ago and chatting to one of their archivists about how many 1,000 pages she could get through a day. So there's a lot going on there. Modern Records Centre at Warwick University, very important. In Manchester, or Salford, in Salford, you've got the Working Class Movement Library, which again has lots of union records, some of them digitised, some of them just in the library to be accessed. Other places that are worth looking at, the Labour History Archive and Study Centre at the People's History Museum in Manchester, which actually also has an amazing collection of trade union banners. It's the National Centre for Trade Union Banners, and wonderful things to look at. The TUC library collections at the London Metropolitan University, and that's got pretty much all of the trade union journals. So again, that's an important, you get sort of different records have gone off to different places, and that's a really important collection. And actually there is a TUC website called, it's the URL is unionhistory.info, and that's got a lot of records on there, including the records of the match workers strike, which is really interesting stuff and worth a look. Bishopsgate Institute in London, National Libraries of Scotland and Wales and so forth, and local archives as well. But certainly, Warwick and the Working Class Movement Library in Salford are really, really important centres for holding records. But it's sort of tragic that a lot of stuff has just been destroyed, hasn't survived and so forth. But
it's always worth checking the newspapers as well, I think, because I think it's certainly and family memorabilia as well. I've got a client at the moment whose ancestor was in a trade unionist, and he only knows that because he's got the little card that he was originally issued with the rules about keeping it secret.
Yes,
which is with his photo, and it's amazing. So
that's great. I mean, if you've got a card, if you've got a badge or something, that sort of short circuits a lot of that early research. That's fantastic. It takes you right to the place you need to be.
That's kind of genealogy gold, though, isn't it? But but I'm going to go have a hunt though, because I know I'm absolutely sure I have East London dock workers, and I just need to check what years they were there, but I'm pretty sure it would have covered that period. So I will be taking you up on all your hints. Having a little look, and I will make sure that all those links are included in a blog post that goes out along with this, so that people don't have to scribble them down whilst they're listening if they're catching up on this on their podcast or on YouTube. So before you go, Mark, because I'm conscious that I've kept you just slightly over the time, and you've been really generous with your time, so thank you. Where can people go and find you and your work? Just remind everybody.
Probably the easiest place to find me is through my Chartist Ancestors website. So that's chartistancestors.co.uk. As I say, there is also the unionancestors.co.uk website that I have. I'm on Twitter under my name as / Mark Crail, but I'm also the web editor and social media officer for the Society for the Study of Labour History. So you can look us up on Twitter or on the online for that as well.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Mark, for joining me again. once again, I really, really enjoy talking to you. I love this kind of working class history. I find it really fascinating, probably because I can relate to it a bit more. So having working class ancestors. So yeah. So thank you very, very much for joining me and
Well,
for
thank you.
letting
It's
me
been great
waffle on
fun.
at you. Thank you.
Greatly enjoyed it.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.